Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Mage, Errant, Book 4, The Lost City of Ithos, chapters 28 through 34, Mage Eater, Lake Nelu, Shadow Architecture, The City of Sunset Without Light, Movement in the Dark, Exile Splinter, and Playing Defense. This is a lot. I am going to do my best. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode. Dan is here in the chat, and Dan had noticed that I was running short on time, and really thoughtfully was like, can I add in a couple episodes to break this up a little bit more? But unfortunately, I am already booked, and I am not able to fit in episodes. So I am going to have to be kind of brutal with myself about not going off topic too much. And I'm kind of curious, Dan, and I'll ask you because you're the person who commissioned this. There are times where you want me to talk about my feelings on theme or the, extra layer of, I'm sorry guys, I keep getting a call, and I'm going to just put my phone on Do Not Disturb, which I thought it was already on. I want to know whether you're looking for more that tangenty, opiniony stuff, or are you looking for more beat by beat stuff? And it is okay if that changes depending on what the grouping of chapters are. But I just thought I would mention it to you, and that way, if there is a time where, I'm about to record and you're like, this is something that has some deep conversations about friendship and life, and that's what you want me to really zero in on, I will try and do that versus just talking about beat by beat action, which I don't tend to do, but there are times where I will get kind of caught up in it because there's especially with these books, he has a lot of action interspersed with changes in POV and sometimes funny dialogue. So it will be very easy for me to get caught up in going back and forth to each person. Dan says, not beat by beat normally. The point of this is hearing your takes on the stuff. Okay. All right. So this section, we have, first of all, just to really summarize, they find the lost city of Ithos. And they are in it in a weird sort of parallel dimension-y type of way. And poor Hugh sees something in the shadows and is like, what is that? And he finally can tell it's the Mage Eater that followed them into the city, which is truly unreasonable. Come on, man. But I just wanted to mention that out of the gate because it never occurred to me that Mage Eater would follow them in. I guess that I had just been sort of under this assumption that Mage Eater would be repelled for whatever reason by the magic of what was camouflaging the city in order to because the Mage Eater is anti-mage. So I'm thinking it's going to want nothing to do with it. And it turns out that's not really a problem for it in any sense. So we start off chapter 28 and we're still on the, what is it called? The Despondent Toad. Captain Narsa is just delightful. It turns out she hasn't learned any of her crew's names and is very strict about not knowing anybody's names. And we have a lot of her throughout these chapters chiming in with what the fuck? What is that about? at different moments. And the one time that they are wanting her to say, what the fuck, what is that about? She does not. She can tell what they're talking about when they say Imperial Ithos is nearby. And she's like, why would the lost city of Imperial Ithos be anywhere near here? And they all look at each other like, oh shit. And Alustin is like, okay, I'm going to go shoot a text to Kanderon. But we still have Hugh's fucking spellbook trying to make things up to Talia and dropping a corpse flower in her lap. The flower that's described here. Yeah, this is a real thing. It is a corpse flower, and it is like something that blooms once every like 7 years or something wild like that. And I have never really understood the fascination with something that smells like rotting meat. But evidently it's a big attraction for a lot of tourists and stuff. More power to you, I guess. So they see a tiger, and there's a lot of like, is this the tiger or is it just a tiger? And there comes a point, I absolutely loved it, by the way, where everybody just sort of notices a member of the crew is missing. And like, Hugh had put down a ward, and I really enjoy the fact that he's not thinking like 3-dimensionally. So he's putting the ward around the perimeters of the ship, but he isn't thinking about what if there's just a branch overhanging the ship and you just drop down from directly above. He's got a tube-shaped ward, and he needs a dome-shaped ward. So everybody looks up. There is this one member of the crew who has just disappeared, and they search the whole ship and they just find a couple of paw prints and a little bit of blood, and they didn't hear a sound. And if that is not the most boss shit you ever heard, that is genuinely terrifying. It would just be so much less scary if they had seen any of that moment, you know, even if they heard a cry, anything. The fact that this dude gets taken down in such a way that there's no scream, there's nothing, fucking terrifying. Oh my God. This is just, and there's a point later where he was thinking to himself, it's so weird that I'm heading for this like abandoned city that was run by these fucking Nazis, and I'm over here, you know, like worrying about the Mage Eater. And why would I be worried about a tiger when there are these potentially like universe eating cold mines coming on? And I'm just like, Hugh, it makes total sense that you're going to be a lot more concerned about the immediate threat than the hypothetical threats of a thing that feels very nebulous and unreal, I'm sure, still in your mind. It's just, of course you would. How are you going to worry about the cold mines when there's still a question in the air about whether you're going to be alive by the time you get there? I don't blame you at all, sir. We also, we're going down the river here, and there are these weird little rounded islands, and Captain Narsa is like, she yells mossbacks, and absolutely everybody on the crew is like, oh shit. And they hit the brakes, so to speak, and reverse as much as they can. And when Hugh's like about to be like, what's going on? Alustin just like, so they have to really keep their voices down. And eventually one of these islands moves and sticks its head up out of the water. It's a fucking turtle that's big enough to have like things growing on its shell, which is amazing. And they're Pokemon, right? Like they just are. I love it. And when he lifts his head up, he has got a crocodile larger than Hugh in its mouth that is dripping blood. That bitch is dead already. I love this. Everyone stayed remarkably quiet until they'd backtracked to another river channel going upstream. Whoo, babe. And at one point, Arthur is like, yeah, those things are really nothing to fuck with. Don't be caught, like, don't underestimate them based on what you know about turtles and apply that to these guys, because they can sprint faster than you. They can swim faster than you. They can bite right through your bones. And because they have those fucking shells, they are really, really hard to kill. And all I could think about was hippopotami. Hippopotamuses? I always forget what the plural is. I think it's hippopotami, and the one that's usses is octopuses. But a hippopotamus, y'all, they are so not to be trifled with. And I'm sure if you've listened to any of my shows, you've already heard me say this, so I'm so sorry that I'm being repetitive, but I think these fucking stats bear repeating. And also, if you are able to go onto YouTube and search this, I implore you to do so, because hearing about it is nothing compared to actually seeing it in front of your face. But hippos are the number 2 cause of, or is it number 1 cause of animal death in Africa? They outpace lions. Hippos, by the way, are vegetarians. So they don't kill people because they're going to eat them. They just kill people because fuck people, am I right? Which honestly, I have to respect. You're not even going to eat me. You're just going to kill me and fucking leave me there and give me the finger as you walk away. How can I even be mad? That's just really knowing what you want. And I admire it. And then people see hippos and think that they are fat. Actually, hippos are almost all muscle. They have so little fat on their bodies that they sink to the bottom of lakes and rivers. So they don't swim after you. They run along the bottom of the lake or the river after you, sprint full out. And they can go something 40 miles an hour running, something crazy. And I feel like I'm giving you guys sort of conservative estimates here. But if there is a video that I saw where this person is driving away from a group of hippos at full fucking speed on their speedboat, and there is a wake pursuing, it's like something out of a fucking horror movie. There's a wake beside the wake from their own boat that is pursuing them, and it is keeping up. If anything, it's closing in, and you're watching it oh my god, because they're clearly going as fast as they fucking can in the boat. And then all of a sudden the hippo breaches the water, and it's 5 feet ahead of the front of the wake. It's so much closer than it looked like it was when you could only see the wake from underwater. And this bitch was feet, single digits feet away from the back of their boat. It was about to completely ruin their lives. And I have watched that video with my mouth hanging open. I can't tell you all how many times. And it never ceases to impress and terrify me. So anyway, I just really I have always said that if I'm somebody who personifies any animals, I like to imagine that I personify the unexpected aggressiveness and toughness of a hippo with the mischievous and adorability of a raccoon. And I feel like if you didn't take the size into account and you just, were able to get them sized accordingly to each other, you could make a pretty good combo of a raccopotamus, and it would be a really cute animal. So that's some nightmare fuel for you. Okay, so yeah, this moment is just it's very intimidating, and there's a moment where they go through all of these midges as well, and Hugh finally thinks to himself, you know what? fuck the jungle, for real. I hate this. And just as he's thinking that, next to him, Talia is like, I fucking hate the jungle. And he's so like touched that they were clearly thinking the same thing. And I love that for them. There is nothing like that moment when you're dating somebody and you think something to yourself and they say it out loud and you're like, oh boy, we're really on the same wavelength. But yeah, I love the midges. They don't even like bite. They don't do anything. They just like get in your eyes and get in your mouth. And I think we've all probably run across those kinds of bugs. And it's so gross. Oh my God. It's so gross. You inhale them like, blah. So this is, we in chapter 29, Lake Nelu. This is when Hugh and Talia are talking, and oh no, wait, my bad. They are talking a little bit later. This is the first one just about how they hate jungles. It's later on that they're talking, and he goes to kiss her and he sees the building. Here is when Alustin mentions, oh, okay, so the Havathi are coming after us. They didn't see some of those turtles though, and they have lost some people, so we're doing pretty good, actually. And the captain is just like, Havathi? You never said anything about that. What the fuck is going on? And she winds up basically convincing her by being like, we're going to pay you so much money that you will be able to retire. And like, you'll be able to retire disgustingly. You can buy an island kind of retired. And she's like, all right, I guess we're doing it. And I was sort of worried that she was going to wind up getting killed somehow. And I guess there's still a possibility that something happened that we didn't see. And but I really want Narsa to cash in. I want her to get to retire. Narsa just feels like somebody who's put her fucking time in. You know, like she deserves it. I don't know much about her personality, but I am willing to bet she has earned a retirement like this. And I feel like she's the type of person that if she had a bunch of money, she would be very generous with the people around her. She'd be good for the economy. That's what I'm saying. So let's see. This is when Alustin is like, okay, this is it. This was the location. And Hugh says, did the exile splinter just tear it out of the ground and leave this lake? Are we going to get crushed when it returns? And Alustin is like, yeah, I don't think that's what's going on. I think the lake was here before Ithos. And because it's phasing in and out, like that's causing the floods. If the lake were created because of Ithos's like disappearance, the city phasing in and out would really be fucking things up even worse. Because the water has to be displaced and then go back. It's just such a weird, And I love Talia. What happens if part of it phases into the same location we're occupying? Will we die horribly as our flesh merges with the ruins of Ithos? No. Why would it? What? That's a disgusting image. No. It'll just shove us out of the way. I love that moment so much. There are just a lot of these little bits in these books where you can tell that Brian Bierce was like, I'm not sure what I want to do here. I'm going to have Talia ask the question and then I'll like answer it within the story because I'm just sort of spitballing, deciding. And we have a lot of questions here asking like what Ithos looked like. And eventually it becomes clear that they are right in the path of one of these buildings that's about to resurface. And it is coming up fast because it's not resurfacing in the way like it's literally coming up from under the water. It's like there and they're in and amongst it as it materializes basically. And it's just occasionally there and then suddenly not there. So it is a real weird situation that they're trying to deal with. And thank God they have Alustin with the scrying, because I'm pretty sure if he weren't there, they weren't going to make it out of this at all. So we have this bit with Talia. She's explaining. She says, I think I understand why Dreamfire does all sorts of weird things when it hits. And she describes this. I've read this twice now, this section. I have no idea what the fuck. So, affinities are intersections between axes that describe physical properties. Dream and a handful of other affinities are axes rather than nodes. Dreamfire acts to unmoor the properties of its target along the dream axis, which intersects anything that shows up in dreams. There is no telling what new node it will land on. It's just a targeting apparatus for the unmooring effect. It governs how the unmooring travels through solid objects. If I had learned to manifest a different, separate dream sort of attack, it would cause the unmooring in an entirely different way. No one's ever manifested dream lightning before, to my knowledge, but if they did, the unmooring effect would travel in the way lightning travels, rather than traveling the way fire travels. And I think I mostly get it, but I don't have good luck holding the concept of the axes and nodes in my head and what she's trying to describe. I am sure if I saw it, I would be like, oh, but trying to picture this, not happening for me. So I am going to just accept this and move on. It is not important for me to really get it as long as I've been given the facts here. So this is the moment where Hugh goes to kiss Talia, sees the building, and is just like, oh shit, it's happening. Because he's got the night vision reminder. So he's seeing everything before anybody else does. And he sends out a star form, and Alustin, because they have been sort of trying to keep a low profile a little bit, is like, what are you doing? And finally sees and realizes, oh shit, there it is. And it says the shadow buildings didn't seem to cast shadows of their own, and Hugh started feeling disoriented as he looked for them. Not a horrible, intrusive sort of disorientation like the listener in the Silent Straits had given him. This was a more natural disorientation brought on by looking at something that didn't make sense to your eyes, which that is always a weird feeling. You know, I have this a lot when I see something that's like a lot bigger than I'm expecting, and my brain just can't make sense of it. And I'm like, that looks photoshopped, even though I know it's not, but it just looks like it is. It doesn't look real. So this is when Alustin is like, okay, so there's going to be a flood in a second because the whole city is going to show up. And we're like in the middle of an apartment building. So we need to get the fuck out of the way. And then the ship lurches and we have a bunch of like emergency handling. He has to take the mast of the ship off because they're about to go like under a bridge. And God knows, if he didn't do that, probably the entire thing would have just capsized. I love when he like yells at the captain and she's just like, don't tell me what to do. Honestly, as much as it feels like a petty thing to say at the moment when it's a true emergency, I felt for her on that. He shouldn't. Like, she knows what she's doing, dude. Just give her the fucking grace. So, let's see. There was a clattering, and Narsa's husband poked his head out from below decks. He gave their surroundings a slow, suspicious stare, then slowly retreated back below. A moment later, he reappeared just for long enough to throw Hugh's grumpy spell book out from below decks. Hugh really didn't want to know what that was about. I do. I want to know what that's about. I really, really do. So, yeah, he's putting his hand out, feeling this stone as it's beginning to come into being. And Alustin is looking around and is like, all right, we're where we need to be. We're going to stay here. And he gives Narsa this insane check to pay her. I love him being like, any respectable bank should have that amount, but I would go to someplace in a city because you want to make sure they have enough to cover it. Don't try and fuck around with the totals, please. But what happens here, because they're all standing amongst these ruins, is that Alustin has, it's such a wild thing. He has to make them be seen as like part of the memory of the city so that when the city goes away again, they will go with it. And I didn't exactly follow how this works within this ward because he has Hugh basically make any ward he feels like. It doesn't matter. But the weirdness of it is that as they disappear into the city, their body parts look like they're disappearing. So at one point, Godric's arm is gone, and then he's like looks up and his dad's mouth is gone, and he tries to say something, and when he says something, his mouth is gone, and they all remain remarkably calm for something that sounds like a bad dream, but good for them, I guess. So let's see. Here it is. This explanation. Based on what I know of how the exile splinter works, including us in a ward like that should be more likely to make it consider us part of Imperial Ithos and take us with it back into the pocket dimension. And that's kind of all the explanation that we get, but I didn't really understand how that would work. And they come back, they I don't know how to say this. I keep wanting to use the word like wake up in the city, but they don't go to sleep. There's no moment of unconsciousness. It's just sort of like watching themselves vanish. It's really weird. And we have a mention here of the Emperor. There's this story that apparently Godric was kind of into as a kid. And he is the last emperor, and it says there were countless stories of the warlord trying to rebuild Imperial Ithos or get revenge for its destruction, though now he supposed that the last emperor had been trying to retrieve Ithos from its exile, not trying to rebuild it. Funny how he'd never questioned Imperial Ithos' fate while under the exile splinter's influence. It had never even seemed strange to him that he didn't know where the Empire's heart had been. And I really like this as just like a metaphor. You know, there's a reason that they call it going woke, and I know that's turned into a pejorative by a bunch of assholes, but I'm going to keep it as a good thing. And it is wild once that happens, and you're just like, how did I not see any of this before? This is really obvious, and I was not exercising my critical thinking. So apparently he was supposed to have had like a dozen affinities. Alestin says only 9 because Kanderon evidently was alive when this guy was around. Which makes sense. Like he's not, you know, the way he's described is like he was there for Ithos being exiled. So that makes sense. And 9 is still insane. And Archer says there was the 2-legged army on the Galid continent, at least a dozen different minds, all trapped in a single body, each with their own affinities. They were thought to have at least 30, which, why are they trapped in a single body? Like, what the fuck? And then Alustin mentions the stone arborist had around 20 affinities, all for different types of stone. She wasn't a battle mage, though. She used her magic for art, crafted an entire forest of stone trees deep in the Skyhold Mountains. Most of them are still there, but it's nearly inaccessible. It's about as north as you can go without hitting the sea. I hope we go there because that sounds really cool. Like, I mean, that sounds just dope. And a little bit of talk about developing new affinities. And Hugh asks, what's the easiest new one? And Alustin says, cheese affinity. And they think he's joking, but he's like, no, genuinely, about 3 years and you can do it. And somebody's like, what do you use that for? And he says, aside from making cheese, well, and he gets cut off. And I really want to know, is there anything more to be done with it? Because that feels like it's kind of a one-note thing. However, I'm not mad about it because cheese is spectacular. So that's fine. So here it is. All at once, his vision snapped back together and everything that was shadow became fully visible. And they listen and they cannot hear any of the sounds of the jungle. They are in a whole different space right now. And Hugh is feeling a little bit wobbly. He mentions that he can actually sense his connection to Kanderon, which is not something that normally he can feel. And there is this moment here where Arthur is looking like really worried. And Godric is thinking about how Arthur is so powerful that he has not really been in many situations where he was like off his footing, because he always knows he can handle whatever is coming. But they now are going into a situation that he truly has no understanding of, really. And it is kind of flipping him out in a way that he doesn't normally get shook, you know? And Godric, meanwhile, is somebody who is always feeling like things are sort of out of his control. So he isn't experiencing that acute discomfort that his father is. And we have a back and forth with the two of them here that's really, really sweet, in which basically Arthur says, I really sometimes feel regret at the fact that I have as much power as I have, and that you are showing signs of being able to become as powerful as me eventually. Like, I would have loved to have a life where we could just like brew ale and go, you know, you would just go to school and I would just be your dad. And that can't happen when we can do what we can do. And not only that, but I have done things that have earned me enemies. So if I ever die, you're just going to get those enemies coming after you, because it's that kind of hatred where it will pursue you. And there's always going to be someone out there that's going to know what you can do and want to take advantage of you. And it's not really a choice. Like, those people are just going to be out there, and you can like choose how you respond to that. But you can't opt out of people knowing what you can do and having their own plans. And I hate that I didn't have that choice, and that I can't protect you from that situation as well. Like, this, you're just winding up having to get into a lot of this because of me. And you also have to prove yourself against me, because nobody is looking at you as your own person. And Godric is like, yeah, no shit. I have been living that life. I am aware. And he says, I've never resented you for an instant, though. At least, not that I wasn't immediately ashamed of myself for. You did your best for me, even after Mom got sick, and you taught me better than anyone else could. And Arthur says she'd be proud of you, you know, as proud as I am. And it's really sweet. I love this so much. So this is when we start to realize why this city was named what it was named. What is it? Like Eternal Sunset or something? And it like is the stone has like captured these colors, and apparently it's not as vibrant as it would have been, but it is still like giving quite an impression. And Alustin keeps being like, God damn, this is really gorgeous. And like, I can only imagine what it used to look like. It must have been crazy. And I love too the mention of they can understand all the street signs and everything. And Alustin says, the Ithonian language has changed very little in the past 500 years. We don't know what they did to it, but they somehow stabilized it, made it more resistant to change. Whatever they did, though, it started breaking down over the years. A couple centuries ago, you wouldn't even find regional accents, and now you have accents as thick as the Lethalan one, which is Godric's, which is very, like, you know, Scottish-y. But I thought that the concept of like stabilizing a language so that it stays the same is a really interesting thing. And like, I don't want that, because the evolution of language is something that's really fascinating and fun to watch. As soon as you learn to like not be a prescriptivist anymore, which took me some time, I will admit. But, you know, there is a temptation to be like, I wish that I could just read in the context of how I understand it today, a document from 900 years ago. But there's also a lot to be learned by the fact that the language is so different, and like what exactly to read into and what to take at face value based on like a reference or a custom that they're like kind of tacitly mentioning. So anyway, Talia, anyone else getting really creeped out by this place? And at one point Hugh looks over and there's written in letters gouged a full hand's length into the stone wall by some mage was a single word: hungry. Hugh shuddered and looked away. And he has a lot of moments later where he is consciously avoiding looking at all of the graffiti. And I was like, yeah, I feel like that's a good call. I don't know that if there's anything genuinely like worrisome about it, that it's magical in any way, but I don't feel like you need to keep putting yourself into the position of getting more and more freaked out. It's bad enough. You don't need to add like the last words of everybody, you know, or whatever. And then we have this awful moment. Talia has sort of stopped dead and she's looking in this way that is like, obviously she's very disturbed by something, which Talia doesn't tend to have this happen. So the fact that she is reacting like this, I was like, oh, I don't really want to know what this is. And Sabe is noticing that it's getting colder because as it gets sort of blocked off from reality, the city had warmth flowing through it from coming into reality for a moment. And then as it sort of sidles out, it begins to lose the heat. And they are getting really cold. And Godric bends down to pick something up out of the ash and then realizes what it is and drops it and staggers. And Talia tells them finally that she can feel all of these and more in the distance, and they weren't all burned at the same time. Some shards were burned decades later than the oldest ones. They're all human. And then she has to go vomit. And vomits several times, by the way. She like keeps heaving. And the fact that like her affinity can tell how many there are is like, you know, this would be horrible no matter what, but she can like quantify it in a way that others can't. And that gives her an awareness of it that is extra awful. And Arthur, for his part, is just like, we shouldn't have come here. This is a fucked up place. And Alestin's like, well, whether we should have or not, we are here, and it's too late for that. And it is the best place to wait for Kanderon's return. There's nobody else here. And this is when Hugh is like, yeah, there's something there. We are not by ourselves. And it takes a little while before Hugh realizes what it is. So they have to find the exile splinter. And they begin moving through the city, and it's just a really weird situation because the way that the light works is sort of tricky on the eyes, and it's obvious that whatever is pursuing them, before he realizes that it's a mage eater, he is like, maybe we can lose it in the dark. And then it starts to become clear that whatever it is can see them just fine, and it's not being affected by that. And let's see. He waited until they reached the center of a huge courtyard, then gestured to everyone to stop. He reached out to the stone around them and crystallized a sound ward in it so his voice wouldn't carry past the group. We're playing their game. They know the dark and we don't. And Alestin starts to be like, but we don't have any mana. And then he's like, oh, we're not in a mana desert. We could do something, actually. And Hugh says, everyone use that anti-glare cantrip I showed you. And he fires Starfire Flare, which everybody thankfully did not get blinded by because he warned them, because he's a thoughtful boy, and I appreciate that about you, Hugh. And directly behind them, something screamed and fled. It's the bloody Mage Eater, Hugh said. We're in an extra-dimensional pocket in a ruined city, and we're being stalked by a bloody tiger. It wasn't funny, but Hugh couldn't help laughing anyway, which honestly I get. It's a bit much, as they say. So after revealing that they know this thing is here and where they're located and all this, they're just like, well, whatever. And so he uses his starfire to keep things lit. And let's see. This is when they climb up. Let's see. Use that anti-glare cantrip of Hugh's just in case the sun is up. To Hugh's surprise, it was still night when they returned to Anastas, and not even that late, maybe a little past midnight. I'm going to get some scrying done, Alustin said. See how our Havathi friends are doing. And this is when Hugh notices the Mage Eater again. And she's just far enough away that taking a shot at her, Hugh suspects he wouldn't even be able to reach. The cat snarls and turns away, and Hugh was just like, all right, she's still biding her time, but she's following us. And that is a really uncomfortable position to be in. I hate this for them. So he says the Havathi are closer than I'd hoped. And the good news is we're maybe a 15-minute walk from the exile splinter. We'll set up camp close to it. And Sabé says, how many days are we going to have to hold off the Havathi for until Kanderon gets here? And Alustin says, hours, I think you mean. Kanderon should be here tomorrow night at the latest. Which then brings up the concept of travel in this universe and what the fastest way to travel is. And Alustin mentions Thunderbringers, which Archer rolls his eyes at, because apparently that's like so rare it's not even worth talking about. But they fly so fast they break the sound barrier, which is amazing. And he's like, but no, Kanderon can't do that. She can fly for days without rest, and she can sleep while she's flying, which is pretty cool. So yeah, she'll be here in not too much longer. So this is when they see the exile splinter, and Hugh is like, it's not glowing. It should glow. Come on. Honestly, I agree. I mean, you know, like, give us something. Give us a spotlight. I don't know. The splinter was jagged, crooked, and asymmetrical spike of blue crystal, 3 times the height of Godric or Archer, hovering point down above the ground. Obscenely complex spell forms covered its surface and could be made out within its crystal structure. And deep within the splinter, at its highest point near the top, was a great beating heart of shadow. Ew. Hate it. Hugh tried reaching out to it with his crystal affinity sense, but he felt as though it were as if it were an inordinate distance away. The pattern of the crystal was irregular and twisted in a way that crystal shouldn't be, as though the spell forms visible in the outer layers were replicated at a level too small to see with the eyes, which is a really, really cool idea. The concept of like, well, if we're going to use like spell forms and, you know, visible writings, what if we shrunk that writing down to something that's almost microscopic and then packed it in, like a ton of it into a very small space? That feels like it would have a very different effect than something written at regular handwriting size, you know? I think that's neat. So it's hovering over the sealed off labyrinth. And Hugh says, why is there a heart in it? I have no idea, Alustin said. Kanderon has told me absolutely nothing about how she and the other Skyhold founders made the exile splinter. And I just want to say now that I hope we find out that Ithos was just as bad as it seemed, and that the Ithonians were truly the monsters they sound like, because I am so worried we are going to find out that there was a whole other reason for exiling this place, and that, oh, they were bad people who did bad things. I'm worried that's just going to have been kind of like a side effect and an afterthought, and that there was another reason for it. Because I don't really fully trust Kanderon. You know, like, why would I? I don't know anything about her. So I'm just sitting here kind of side-eyeing absolutely everything at this point. And the fact that, like, she hasn't told Alustin anything, there could be a million reasons for that are completely responsible. You know, not even just, like, fair, but actually good ideas that are thoughtful about everyone involved. But I don't know that. And so I'm just operating on oh, she didn't tell you, huh? Interesting. And that's kind of unfair. So Talia is just like, why didn't they just destroy it? And I'm thinking, girl, you don't think that anybody would have thought of just destroying it? Talia has a remarkably, like, a difficult time imagining. She doesn't have a whole lot of imagination. Everything, like, at the beginning of the series was her being like, well, everybody knows you can't blank, blank, blank. And no matter how many times she was reminded that, quote, everybody knows is not a reason, she doesn't keep it in mind. She just hasn't let that sink in. And I feel like if there turns out to be anything where it's like, oh, we were being lied to, and the whole reason that this was done was a different thing, the person who's going to have the hardest time coming to terms with these new facts would be Talia, I have to assume. But I don't know, maybe not. So she says that she's going to try and destroy it. Alustin's like, go ahead. And she just stands and stares at it. And finally, he was like, Talia? She says, what? Weren't you going to try and destroy the splinter? Was I? And she just forgot. Like, it made her forget the desire to attempt to damage it. And Sabe is like, well, if it can do this, why can't we just leave it to its own devices? And it turns out it can be stolen. Alustin says at least it can be moved once the pocket dimension collapses entirely, which won't be long now. Given that we're in it now with the knowledge of the exile splinter and the Havathi are going to be looking for it, I doubt it will even last out the next day. Talia says, so why didn't the Ithonians cause the exile splinter to decay? I presume because they were in the city when the exile splinter struck, but I honestly don't know. There's only so much Kanderon has told me about it, and I'm sure there's a lot she's held back. So they set up their tent, and when Hugh woke in the palace room they'd claimed and fortified, it was already mid-morning. And we have that tea pop up again, which again, I'm going to say I think is like, oh my God, I have already forgotten it. Kombucha, which I really like, but I understand why people would not. And Alustin tells them with great excitement that there is no cold mind incursion in the pocket dimension, which Talia says is anticlimactic, and Alustin is like, what the fuck is wrong with you, for real? And I kind of understand what she means. I mean, I'm assuming that the cold minds are going to turn out to be a factor, actually, but as of right now, we don't have to deal with them, and I'm really glad we don't. Thank you. I don't want to. I am tired on everybody's behalf in this story. And he says the phasings are almost hourly. We've got maybe 6 hours until the Havathi arrive if we're lucky. We need to set up defenses. And Sabe says, well, let's get to work. So then we get chapter 34. When the first of the Havathi boats hit the outer edges of their defenses, Sabe couldn't help but laugh. It was more to release frustration than out of actual amusement. She'd felt entirely useless during the construction of their defenses, her only duty watching others' backs in case the Mage Eater had slipped back into the pocket dimension at some point. And they are coming at them at top speed. They hadn't expected to encounter icebergs in a tropical lake. Admittedly, they weren't very large, half the size of the ships. And I really enjoy this concept. You know, this is something that Hugh and Godric had both been practicing, like working with ice, and it's fun to see it manifest in such a practical way. Every time the city phased back in, the icebergs had been sent hurtling and crashing around the lake, and they were surprisingly hard to spot in the ever-present mists. That's like a perfect weapon. I love this idea. And when the ships hit, it's not even like necessarily that the ship is completely destroyed or anything. They will just like have enough damage that they probably will sink before too long, or they'll hit so hard people will be tossed off the deck. Like, it's certainly wreaking enough havoc. It's doing well. The Havathi lost a quarter of their force without ever coming into contact with the party from Skyhold, which is amazing. I mean, that's so embarrassing for you. Several mages and at least one swordsman drowned as they abandoned their ships for the city. The canals were lethally dangerous with all the ice trapped in them. And then in the city, Talia and Godric had hidden bones in pockets Godric had grown inside the cobblestones. Alestin, using his far-seeing, let Talia know which ones the Havathi were passing near. The Havathi eventually learned the trick of it and scouted their way with stone mages to avoid the bonfire traps, but not before Talia had killed quite a few of them. And I'm assuming she's using human bone for this, which is sort of like... I mean, she doesn't have much choice. It's hugely practical, and if I were her, I would also do it. But I would definitely have like a qualm about it. It would feel weird to do. You know what I'm saying? And then we have Alestin's paper traps, where they are just getting cut to ribbons. It was Hugh, though, who really proved his worth. Sabé had seen Hugh use his wards in battle before, but he'd always been rushed while completing them. They'd been spur-of-the-moment acts of desperation. These wards, though, were terrifying. Like all their defenses, Hugh had started in at the Exile Splinter, leaving some of his most impressive work there. By necessity, the wards grew hastier and less terrifying the farther out they went, as Hugh had needed to construct them larger and more expansive. Sabé had thought Hugh's wards would be a series of expanding concentric rings, but the city's design hadn't allowed for that, nor, apparently, was that actually optimal. An enemy ward breaker only had to break circle wards in one spot to pass. Hugh had still used concentric circle wards around the Exile Splinter, but nowhere else. Hugh's wards instead were scattered strategically around the city, buried in the stones of bridges, narrow walkways, and the entrances of buildings that offered effective cover, which is an amazing idea. He has done, you guys, say it with me, Hugh has done a Kevin McAllister. Hugh is home aloneing the lost city of Ithos with his wards. And I am here for it so hard. I am loving this. And I am imagining a lot of this being done with like household implements. And just, please don't rob me of this. This is just good. This is how I'm thinking of it. The sheer diversity of Hugh's wards was kind of astonishing. Attention wards shepherded the Havathi away from less defended and more open areas without them even realizing. Flame wards ignited anyone who stepped over them. Simple force wards sent them tumbling into the canals. Glass wards shattered bottles of who knows what carried by various mages as the wards blocked the passage of glass and only glass. Gold and silver wards blocked the passage of jewelry, gruesomely tearing out earrings and breaking the fingers of people wearing rings. I mean, ew. Oh my God. Like, oh my God. Yeah, right. Dan is in the chat, says wards probably less lethal than many of Kevin's traps. Honestly, probably. Kevin McAllister truly did not care for human life. It was not a concern for him. The Havathi took the worst damage from the defenses the first time they phased into the pocket dimension within the city. Their positions became even more obvious to the Skyhold party, who were entirely hidden behind wards and shaped stone defenses. Hugh's wards became especially frustrating for them in the dark, because many of them were attention wards specifically built to split apart the Havathi war party, forcing them to spend valuable time reuniting. I'm coming, Harry. This is delighting me. I love it. I love characters like Hugh, whose strength is thinking ahead and organizing and preparing, getting to do that. You know, immediate unpredictable battles are all well and good and super interesting in their way. But this is giving Lyndon, and I can't get enough of it, because this is the kind of person that I also am. I am a planner, and I think up contingencies, and I would absolutely be working with this kind of magic. I feel like if magic were a real thing and it suddenly just became real for all of us, I would be setting up shit like this, and I just love seeing it. It's so delightful. So the phases are coming like faster, which is kind of putting the Havathi through it even more. And Sabe is inside this ward that lets her observe everything. It's behind an attention ward. It had one secondary function. It was a momentum magnifier. Just once, when she wind jumped out of the ward, it would amplify the jump to speeds and distances far beyond what she normally would have been able to reach. And she had to pick her moment correctly. So this is all about delaying. They know there are too many Havathi to actually defeat, and it's just not going to happen. So all they're attempting to do is waste their time and keep them from being able to get there before Kanderon does. And it says the Havathi, of course, decided not to cooperate. They'd expected the Havathi to eventually come up with the plan of escaping the city into the canals while it phased into Anastas and positioning themselves closer to the exile splinter unopposed in Lake Nelu. And that's the thing that they had thought. But what the Havathi do is try to do it after only a single phase. The time spent phased into the pocket dimension without the Havathi stretched longer and longer until most of an hour must have gone by. With fewer splinter-aware minds inside the pocket dimension, she assumed that the exile splinter's power must be less strained. When it finally started to phase back, Sabe was fully expecting the Havathi to launch themselves from some sort of improvised magical platform onto the stones of the city. What Sabe wasn't expecting was a massive tower of vines and intertwined trees, stretching almost as tall as the Emperor's palace and standing only a short walk away. And several parts of the tower's base had been ripped and torn apart by the city's phasing, but it stretched across a fairly massive area, and there was more than enough to keep the slender, living tower intact. And Sabe is looking at this and is just like, who the fuck could have done this in that amount of time? Something this size. This is insane. And then realizes, oh, it's Grovebringer, because we did not deal with that person before. And so she's looking at this, trying to decide what to do. Later, Sabe would reflect that Talia would have probably been very angry if she'd heard what Sabe had to say then. She'd probably have a long-winded lecture about things you didn't say because they were asking for trouble, all of which she'd drawn from the novels she'd read. They're playing right into our hands. That, of course, was when the tower started bombarding everything around them with spells. Not least what appeared to be a massive boulder of congealed volcanic ash hurtling straight toward Sabe's tower. Well, well, well. And congealed volcanic ash is crystal, right? Is that something you can deal with? I'm hoping that, like, maybe he could take control of that somehow. I don't know. At least she has a means of getting away and using speed to do so that she's, like, very likely to be unhurt. But that was where I had to stop. So, all right, I am going to wrap this up, but this was a really fun section. I feel like I did well on time. Look at that. Okay. I'm really feeling myself right now. Let me try and remember this next time I realize there's a whole other chapter that I haven't talked about yet. But I am really interested in what happens when Kanderon shows up, because I just don't know if I am taking things at face value with her. So we'll have to see. All right, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Dan, for commissioning this and for your flexibility with me having to reschedule for today. But because it's today, I will see you all tomorrow. So until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.